Well, good afternoon. It is the 7th of April, 2021. And this is one that I really debated doing. I'm going to call it Black Eyes. Black eyes is in, black eyes. Hit in the face and get black eyes. And most people who work in federal law enforcement, if you get hired in federal law enforcement, you go in there with a positive attitude. You go in there with a very idealistic attitude. I've never met anyone who took a job in the federal government or in law enforcement in general who didn't have a positive attitude. But experiences shape different people differently. And many people, many agents will become cynical after a period of time, but recommit. Okay, and that means that yes, there are imperfections in life. There's imperfections in the agency. There's imperfections in the way the government operates. But, I'm still going to do my damnedest to accomplish the mission. And then there's a small percentage of those who are going to cross the line and do things that should never be done. And that's what this video is going to focus on, those few people. I'll tell you personally, the saddest day, I had two really sad days in DEA. One was I was working as a group supervisor in Greenbelt, Maryland, of a task force group. And we had been investigating a group a family that had been selling, essentially the father had been selling crack cocaine out of the house. But then we got word, and this was a couple months before this sad day, okay, that they knew that the informant was a DEA informant, the person we had been sending in to make the buys. And the informant said they had shown him a piece of paper that said he was a DEA informant. Like, this is unbelievable. I don't believe it. I just don't believe that anybody, I don't know what's going on, but certainly that can't be the case. Well, we got another informant who could make a buy into that house, and they did. We got a warrant. We went in there, and what I found was almost stopped my heart. Okay, they had the whole case file, the whole DEA case file. Now, immediately, what goes through my mind as a group supervisor, because it's the documentary evidence that's seized from a house. Is it somebody in my group? Well, it wasn't somebody in my group. They had an acquaintance who worked in the DEA file room in headquarters, and this is near headquarters. Now, for those of you who don't know, the way we do our reports, this was in 2006, 2007, that time frame, they would send their reports to me electronically. I would approve them, and an electronic copy would be sent to DEA headquarters, and it's kept in an electronic file, basically. But what happened is they had a young lady who was working in the file room who was subject to financial inducements, and they asked her to run the address to see on a database that we have. And she pulled up the case number, and then she pulled up all the reports. She printed them out, sold them to these people. And, she was so stupid, she sold the reports, which, of course, are traceable, as to which user ID pulled them up. And she was promptly discovered and removed from her job and prosecuted. And then not long after I left the task force, one of my task force officers, a woman I'm going to put the news report up, but I'm not going to go any further. She was also convicted of going into our database, the DEA database, and compromising an investigation, which was a Title III, a wiretap on her brother by the FBI. Her brother was a drug dealer. And if you want to know why the SF-86 report is so long right now, they want to know who all your relatives are. There's a good reason for that, Now, this is not, of course, limited to the DEA. Throughout my career, you're going to end up working with people who get fired for bad behavior, for corruption. When I was in Miami, we had an agent who was convicted of selling protection to a drug trafficker. And I'll put the news report up. And his name was Jorge Villar and George Villar. And basically the way he fell into the corruption, or the corruption fell into him, was one of his informants went to another agent who he was working with and said, Basically, they were setting up an importation scheme, and what George would do was then sell protection to the traffickers. Well, what the DEA Internal Affairs did was simply set up an importation of drugs from the Bahamas using this informant. And George, didn't of course realize that the informant had been flipped by our Internal Affairs Office of Professional Responsibility. He then went ahead and imported the drugs and did the protection, did the database checks for this guy, got money for it, along with a former Metro-Dade police officer who had been fired for beating a guy nearly to death on the highway. And make a long story short, Villar was fired and went to prison for a long time. Okay. When I was in El Paso, the guy who lived 3 doors down from me, Sal Martinez, went bad. Okay, he actually had done very well in El Paso as an agent, but he was transferred to Mexico, to a DEA office in Mexico, and one of his relatives had been murdered by a 13-year-old. And he then proceeded to hire an informant of the FBI to murder the killer. Yeah, hard to believe, but and he used DEA money to do it. So they called him across the border, arrested him, and he got a very lengthy prison sentence. He since got out and became a bail bondsman, and now he's a motivational. I wish him all the best. I don't have any bad blood, any dislike. His wife attended my son's baby shower, when we adopted my son. My wife and his wife were very good friends. I didn't really know him all that well. He was in another part of the office than I was, but when I left El Paso, I heard about his arrest, and he served a lengthy prison term. And I'm just going to put up a news report, and you can look on it and read about it. But again, I think betrayal by your own is the worst. Certainly in the Customs and Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection, the Border Patrol, there were so many of these things going on where you had corrupt CBP officers, Border Patrol agents, that in 2011 Congress mandated the polygraphing of all new hires. And there was a case of a woman she had come on CBP right after it was formed. And her sister was a comandante in the Mexican Federal Judicial Police. So you can see where this is going right away. And she was an inspector at the border, a CBP officer. And when they would come across the border, she would often feed her sister, who was working in the United States. She's a Mex-Fed with this car is full of drugs, search it. And then she would, of course, say, this car is coming across, don't search it. Once they get you on the hook, they get you on the hook. Well, this young lady was then promoted to ICE as a special agent. She moved from CBP to ICE, and she got access to the informant files. And her undoing, of course, was running somebody for her sister, who was a Mexican police officer, and providing the printout. And at some point, a Mexican police unit that was working with us, that was halfway honest, working with the DEA, got a hold of this printout, which had a picture of a man who had been murdered by drug cartel in Juarez. And they were able to take this. They said this came from a U.S. government database. And using the audit trail, they were able to track it to Special Agent Giovanna Diaz of the ICE Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And then, of course, what happens is the FBI cross-border task force, as they did with Sal Martinez, opens an investigation. And they investigated her for several months. And when they had her, they called her into the U.S. attorney, ostensibly to talk about a case that she has. And really it was to read her rights and tell her, you're in a deep, deep trouble. We want the names of any inspectors, Border Patrol agents, ICE agents who are corrupt. And she was unable to do that. She called her sister. They let her stay out on bond under surveillance. She called her sister. Her sister said she would turn someone in. They didn't. She ended up getting only 3 years in federal prison, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a slap on the wrist. Now, if you were to think that if this is limited to DEA or ICE or the Border Patrol, it's not. The biggest betrayal in history was an FBI agent, a guy named Robert Hanssen. You may have heard about him, may not have. Movies have been made about this jerk. And he's now serving life without parole in a prison in Colorado, the highest security prison, along with a CIA officer named Aldrich Ames. And what this guy did, he worked in counterintelligence for the FBI. And he didn't do it for money. Nobody really knows why the hell he did it. You know, that's the funny thing. You can't figure out why the hell this guy did it. But what he did, for those of you who don't know, counterintelligence, they focus, on foreign governments that are trying to turn Americans as spies. So what the FBI did, and this is all public information, it's all out. This all happened in the 1980s. When the KGB sends an officer to Washington, D.C. to work in the embassy, they don't send you as a KGB officer. They send you under some sort of diplomatic cover. You're doing something else. They don't send you as an intelligence agent. But of course, the Soviet embassy, as it was in the 80s, had KGB officers there. And the FBI figured out who they were. And in several cases, they flipped those officers so that they were double agents. They also worked for us, the FBI, which is good because then we find out who the Americans are who are providing classified information. We can conduct better investigations. Well, what this guy, Mr. Hanssen, did is he then betrayed these officers to the KGB, and they were quietly recalled to the Soviet Union and executed. So he caused the deaths of people. And then after he had done that, actually the Russians really didn't know who he was. He did such a good job covering his tracks, they didn't know who he was. But what they did manage to do is after the Soviet Union fell, one of the officers, the intelligence agents in the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service Bureau, defected with Hanssen's file to the United States. And the FBI was able to figure out who he was. And then the FBI set up a sting operation where it appeared that he was being contacted by the Russian Foreign Intelligence Bureau, but it was actually the FBI. He delivered a cache of documents, left it under a bridge, at which point he was promptly arrested. The deal was you give up everything and your wife will get your pension, but you have to go to jail for the rest of your life. And he took that deal. So he's in jail right now. And so betrayal is probably one of the worst things that you'll ever experience in federal law enforcement. The fact that, or any law enforcement, a brutal cop, that's one thing. A cop who crosses a line, but when somebody does something that is premeditated and egregiously bad, just tarnishes their oath of office, and it really brings down bad publicity on all of us. And as Dan Webb, who was once the United States Attorney in the Northern District of Illinois, said, I went to one of his speeches when I was a student at Western Illinois University, and he said, public corruption, and he was talking about an investigation that he had overseen into Cook County judges who were taking bribes, Operation Greylord. It was a great investigation done by the Bureau, and uncovered several judges who went to prison for a long time. Other judges took their lives when they were confronted with the evidence. But what the case, what he said about it was that public corruption is really one of the worst crimes a man or woman can commit, because whenever a horrific leader, whether it's Adolf Hitler or Vladimir Lenin or Mao Zedong, whenever they take power in these countries, whether it's China, Nazi Germany, Russia after the Kerensky Republic, you had the Bolshevik Revolution, what they focus on is the corruption of the previous officials, and they say, I am the solution to this. And in China, Mao Zedong, who was a bloody dictator who ruled China from 1949 to 1976, responsible for millions of deaths, he said, I can fix the corruption of the nationalist Chinese government, which preceded him. Just put me in, I'll get in through the revolution, I'll purge all of that. Well, he not only killed them, he killed everybody. And Hitler was the same way. The Weimar Republic, very corrupt, ineffectual. I can fix that problem. Okay, the same thing in Russia. And Mr. Webb's point that he made, and it was a very well taken point, was that among these things are the worst crimes that a person can commit because it causes people to lose faith in democracy. And once you lose faith in democracy, you end up with a police state. So they're really the worst type of criminals you can encounter. And whether it's George Villar's case, where he went corrupt with an informant, whether it's Sal Martinez, who was once a friend of mine, who once used DEA money to hire a hitman to kill somebody. I mean, just unbelievably stupid and evil. Okay, whether it is Giovanna Diaz, an ICE officer who betrayed her colleagues, betrayed the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, caused a man's death. Whether it is Robert Hanssen, an FBI agent who betrayed Russians who had put their trust in the FBI. Okay, Russian intelligence officers who put their trust in the FBI. Whether it was just these little file room clerk or a former task force employee who sold or provided information from our database. These things are horrible, but you're going to encounter them, unfortunately. And my advice simply, it isn't hard to follow the rules, have a strong moral background when you come in, and keep that. Now, are you going to get disillusioned on the job? Yes, you're going to get disillusioned, okay? There's a lot in our government, and a lot in law enforcement, and a lot that just takes the wind out of your sails. But at the end, it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness, as our Lord says. So recommit to being the best person you can be. Remember the enthusiasm you had when you were hired, and do your best. If there's nothing else you can do, you can always find a newer agent and train them on how to do the job correctly. And if you make it to supervisory ranks, have strict standards. Have strict standards. Hold your people to accountable standards. That doesn't mean every minor little thing you're running around looking to write people up like you're in the Marine Corps or something. That's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about you have very clear standards, okay, that you communicate, and you will not tolerate certain things. As a supervisor, I did not tolerate, brutality. I certainly would never have tolerated any kind of, anything like that. I've been the first one to call the police on you, call the internal affairs on you. So now I've taken credentials from agents who engaged in bad behavior even before it went to our internal affairs, and they'd call me up from headquarters and say, "Why did you do that?" I said, "Because I don't want him working for me. You can have his credentials and give it back to him if you want, but I don't want him even working for me or carrying a gun." So this has been a little bit of a rant, but I think a necessary rant, okay? Because you're going to hear a lot of bad things during your career or as you go up toward your career, as you're applying. And again, law enforcement is made of human beings. You have a small percentage who are criminals on the job. You have a small percentage who are saints who will never do anything. And you have a large percentage who tend to go along to get along. And if the environment is corrupt, well, then it's going to be like the police in Mexico. But if it's dominated by honest men and women, such as yourselves, and what I tried to be, then it's going to be a good working environment. And the agency, even if it fails in its mission, everyone remembers Elliot Ness. He was an untouchable in an era where the agency, the Bureau of Prohibition, was riddled with corruption. He couldn't be touched, by organized crime. And, his squad was able to put away Al Capone, right? So we still remember him as an honest person, a good man who fought a fight that was, a losing fight in the end, but a good man, okay? And that's how we want to be remembered, right? We want to be remembered as virtuous people. When we look in the mirror, we want to know that we're virtuous people. And we always want to fight the good fight, because after this life, we're going to be judged. So hope this has been somewhat helpful to you. And look at the articles if you want. You can stop it and click on them and read them. But, it's just something that you're going to confront if you go into law enforcement. And that's the reason for the big background investigation and polygraph and everything else, to keep these kind of people out. Okay, God bless.